welcome. This is something that we've been talking about doing with the Severino Center for quite a while, and it's great to bring it to fruition with the help of Kelly Reardon and Clint Ballinger, who have been part of the entire process going through. I'm very excited to have such a group of students that are from just a wide variety of backgrounds, and a lot of speakers that I think will have really interesting stories. For the first class logistics, there's not a lot that's really expected of you to deliver. This is really, I would see this as a benefit of Class Rensselaer. You get to attend, hear from a great network of amazing speakers, understand how they went through that journey of student, of engineer, of computer science major, whatever they were, to eventually changing the world through entrepreneurship.
My name is Brent Solina. I'm a 2011 or 2012 BCBP grad, depending on how you slice it. The difference there is I actually was able to take a co-op for my company while I was an undergrad. And, obviously that's how I got to know Kelly and Jason, is as a student there, I became interested in entrepreneurship after meeting the Innovative guys, who are a speaker series later this season. And the long and short of it is I enjoyed my biochemistry time. The professor that I worked under is actually on this call. I was fortunate enough to have a lot of research experience my freshman year, but it became pretty clear that I was only ever going to be an okay researcher. When I started working with the Innovative folks is when I sort of realized that the entrepreneurial pathway was a lot more accessible than people tend to think. As we mentioned, BCBP grad, the founder of MICROrganic. That's part of the reason why I'm here talking today. I also happen to have a passion for growing carnivorous plants, and I'm an avid adventure and dual sport rider. Those last two aren't particularly relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, though. So let's get right into the meat and potatoes after this delay here. So I was excited to do this talk, but there's a few points that I wanted to cover up front. And the first is that, I'm going to be sharing my story about our technology, our opportunity, and how we assaulted it. But especially as you go through the speaker series this year, you'll notice that there's no single right way to do innovation. By definition, you're doing something that other people haven't done before, and you're creating something that doesn't really exist. There's not going to be a precise formula to that, although certainly there are overarching tones. So as you go through all of this, it's important to remember that what I'm presenting you is my experience, and you're meant to take the best of it and how it applies to, your thought process and what you're looking to do. Which dovetails really nicely into a second guidepost here, which is that no one really knows what they're doing with this stuff. Oh, Jason, if you could back up. Point B here is that no one really knows what they're doing with this stuff. The world around you is not there by design. It is what's endured. Through trial and error, what you see around you is something that seemed to make sense, but very little of it is, the intended product that people had, when they were producing it. Point C is just a good life tip that speaking in contradictions is a helpful tool for creating dramatic effect, which brings us to point D, that there is only one right way to do innovation, and that's whatever gets it done. And you'll see that as a recurring theme. So next slide. Another thing, and I had talked to Jason and Kelly about this, is you see innovation and entrepreneurship presented a lot of ways without the negatives, or with kind of a rosy view of it. And I think it is important to acknowledge in and of yourself that you're capable of great things. But it is important to ask the question, do you want to change the world? Certainly, I've stuck with this for about 10 years now. But at any point, I always felt that I was being enriched both in what I was learning and in the kind of people and connections that I was making, that it has always been worth it. And my point is that, there's a lot of different versions of success. what success looks like for commercializing a dating app or a file sharing platform, is very different. There's a timeline component to it. And on top of that, I just want to drive home that I'm going to present a lot of the challenges we went over, and you are under no obligation to meet those. Any experience you have with entrepreneurship and innovation pays dividends in terms of the people you meet, the resume building. You'll bring that knowledge to any project you're managing, any project you're budgeting moving forward. Don't let long-term challenges dissuade you from, trying a little bit. So next slide. And because of how difficult this process gets, I've always found it very helpful to have guideposts and sanity checks for whether or not sticking with your concept and your idea made sense. These are going to be different person to person, but for me, they were always very simple. One, is what I'm doing valuable? Is there still a monetary value and a good to the world that I'm capable of producing? Two, is it possible? Clearly, if I was developing a time travel machine, that would certainly be valuable, but it's not something that I can physically do. And then three, which is the trickiest one to answer, is it possible for me? Cold fusion is a great thing. I am not equipped to build that in my garage. Similarly, if you're developing a pharmaceutical product, you're never going to be able to not undergo FDA trials. So there's certain things that as you develop your process, you'll have to realize are hard gates that you'll have to pass through. Moving on. So this is where we get into more of the specifics of the story and what we're doing. Typically, you're taught to start with the why of what you do, especially for a technical presentation. However, for that, again, I'm going to refer you to point A, that there's no right way to do this, because it's just not the path we took. I fell in love with the technology and what it was capable of before I really had a solid fit. I knew that there were a lot of different manifestations of it, and we just kind of started adding value to the field as a whole before we really knew what the actual product manifestation was going to look like. Oh, next slide. And this is where we started. Again, I'm a biochemist, biophysicist by education, and I've always been enamored with the molecular machinery that is biology. From a design standpoint, life has a very vested interest in living. So you have billions of years of evolution that have created a molecular toolbox for survival on this planet, which conveniently also happens to be where I live and planned on innovating. What you see there, that eye chart, is a biochemical pathway map that shows all of the equipment that a given cell has to shuttle around organic molecules to suit its purpose. What's always been interesting to me about that is something like a car can only run off 87 octane gas, but any other living thing can consume a very wide variety of organic materials. And it's because of the breadth of interactions that you see there. Microbial fuel cells take all of that science that you see there, all of that electron transfer that's happening, and they funnel it to one specific point. Next slide. What we do is to take advantage of the fact that all life is chemistry, and therefore all chemistry being electron transfer, all life is electric. We let those microbes push electrons into a wire, allowing them to literally breathe lightning. We grow a layer of microorganisms on the anode, shown there on the left. They deposit electrons as they breathe up and that go up and over through a wire, where they're eventually deposited on atmospheric oxygen. There's a reason I'm doing some of the technical details we'll get into, but this is where I fell in love with this tech. With no moving parts, no precious metals, no rare earth metals, we're able to get DC power directly from anything that decomposes. That's the kind of thing that you don't need to have immediately an application for to realize that that has enormous potential. Next slide. And that gets us into the why of all of this. And the short answer is because we have some challenges ahead of us. We are rapidly running out of fresh water. You know, with rising oceans, you're seeing more and more saltwater infiltration. The global improvement of quality of life that's happened, unprecedented in our time, unfortunately also depends on us continually mining carbon from the ground and throwing it in the air, which is going to continue to make this cycle worse. In spite of all of that, and again, when I started learning about this technology, there's energy all around us. You know, again, a pile of leaves has, you know, enough energy to get you from Albany to Buffalo. Your car just can't run on it. So we started looking at a technology that can do energy positive desalination, that, you know, again, has no precious metals or rare earth components. That's the kind of thing that seems to be worth spending a significant portion of your effort on. Next slide. Which brings me to kind of the first bullet point here, which is be flexible but focused. Again, speaking in contradictions is a great oratory technique here. Early on, what we realized is that microbial fuel cells were inherently very valuable, but we also realized that they wouldn't do anything without doing one thing first. And that brought us to our first use case of this technology, which was something that was very important, but was possibly the least exciting application of the technology. And next slide, and that is wastewater treatment. So for this amazing world-changing technology, it turns out you have to start with sewage. What you're seeing there is a process called aeration. It involves putting air directly into the water so the microbes can break down the waste. It happens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and most people are surprised to find out it's about 3 to 7% of all of the energy use in the United States. So about 7 cents on every dollar spent on power in the US goes to throwing air into sewage. That's an enormous amount, and yet there's 7 times the energy within that sewage that is needed for that process. And at the end of the day, this is a technology that saved more lives than antibiotics. So it is absolutely critical that we have a way to do this energy efficiently in the future. Next slide. Oh, back one. So again, going back to our guideposts here, you know, is what you're doing valuable? If you want to live on this planet, certainly seems that way. And given how much energy is being expended on it, certainly someone would be willing to pay for it if you could solve that problem. Is it possible? For us, that part was painfully obviously yes. There is a very large academic community around the technology who's doing a great job. They just had missing parts associated with the commercialization and rollout. Which brings us to the last point, is it possible for me? Is this something that I can acquire the means to actually be able to do? And again, as I say there, that part was obvious and obviously painful because it meant that we would be doing a lot of scale-up technology around a lot of sewage, and that's not the most fun in the world. And this is where we really get into kind of the narrative and sort of the fun part. I promise now I don't need to dwell on the tech as much. This is a picture that Kelly had from some of our first pitches. Kelly gets credit for the joke that the only thing worse than the blur on the camera is how badly that suit fits me. But everything starts somewhere. And for us, it started with about 30 different failed business plan competitions. You know, again, we basically got out there and said, hey, here's this really cool technology. We think it can do a lot of different things. But forming that into a cohesive value proposition, and not only that, but formulating a use of proceeds, a budget, that was a trial by fire. We did not enter having any damn clue of knowing what we were doing. That was something that we developed just by bumping into it. Next slide. But, you know, we made progress quickly. And then this goes better if I'm clicking, but next slide. That was actually us in when we started. The previous unit that we showed was actually our closest competitor. So we're out there pitching, talking about how this technology is going to change the world. They've got those large shipping containers installed at picturesque wineries, and this was our lab at that point. This is 2012. Again, from a strictly innovation standpoint, one of the reasons that I stuck with this technology was that you could make scientific progress in that setting, believe it or not. We had, you didn't need you didn't need pure cultures for the microbes, so this was something that you could make scientific progress in with a lot of resources despite the outward appearance. And sure enough, as the years rolled on, we were able to get out into the field more in 2014. Jason, could you back up 1 second? In 2014, we got out into the field more. And again, we realized we weren't going to be able to do hardcore material innovation. So we focused on adding value to system scale up, system operations, and the kind of thing that you just wouldn't see from the academic community. So now we can move on, Jason. And that wound up being a hard road. Turns out making the electrodes was an incredibly difficult process. Because we didn't have the resources in-house, we wound up focusing pretty extensively on toll manufacturing and working on equipment that we could rent by the hour. That gave us an enormous business plan advantage. Next slide. Turns out the sales process for municipal equipment is, pretty damn convoluted. A wastewater treatment plant, if they know they need upgrades, is going to hire an engineering firm who's going to do, a design over the course of a year. In the process of developing that design, they're going to work with different equipment rep firms to spec the individual equipment. And so as a newcomer to this space, it's very hard to break in. With our focus on scaled manufacturing, which again came from the fact that we didn't have lab facilities to do it by hand, what we realized is that we were in effect generating a manufacturing capacity that the larger entities would find interesting. And that brought us to a business model that's very similar to like microprocessors and phones. You can't go out and buy, a Qualcomm processor, but you're very interested in having the fastest one in your phone. And we realized we could do that in the microbial field space. The big entities don't know how to make these electrodes or have any idea what we're talking about when we say electric bugs. But because we're developing IP and know-how in large-scale manufacturing, we can provide that for them at a price. Next slide. And this gets us into, not just the business 101, but the more experiential side of how this all went. That was a great idea, but at the end of the day, you will miscalculate. Bullet point B, no one knows what they're doing. We had the right idea, but our electrodes kind of sucked, plain and simple. We were making progress on that, but we significantly overestimated the maturity of the innovation pipeline, which is a very fancy way of saying no one knew what the hell we were talking about and they weren't terribly interested in learning. In something like solar, if you have a solar catalyst, or in battery tech, if you have something that increases the performance, there's somebody somewhere who will evaluate that and decide they've got a metric for how interested they are in that. There was no analogy to that for wastewater treatment, and for anybody considering going down this path, I think properly gauging the innovation pipeline, especially if you're focusing on a B2B strategy, is really critical. Otherwise, you need to make sure you've got funding in place to endure a very long learning curve. We did not. We lost our funding. More accurately, we ran it out. As a result, we lost most of our team. Turns out people like to get paid. Jason, if you could roll back one. And that again, at that point, brought us back to those central guide points we had. At each of these junctures, you're sort of faced with this decision of pivot, move on, or double down. And that's a personal decision for you. And, I looked at that where we were, and I had, no people at that point, but was what we were working on valuable? Definitely. Is it possible? I was even more sure. We had made progress. We had more problems identified, and they all seemed surmountable. Is it possible for me? We had been getting better. I had access to better equipment. I knew what I was doing much more for large-scale manufacturing at that point. My electrochemical knowledge was getting better, and we had better connections, and we were starting to get people who cared about this stuff. It's at this point that I kind of introduced another bullet point in this metric, which is anybody else going to do this? That one was important because at that point, this was starting to get tiresome. It was a long road. But this was a technology that I desperately feel needs to be more than a footnote, and it was painfully clear to me that nobody else was going to make that happen. Next slide. Which brings us to one of the biggest points is no matter what the concept is, you have to go places, you have to talk to people, you have to do things, do every conference you can, talk to everybody in every academic field that's tangentially related that you can. Some of that is the connections. Some of that is helping you build your value proposition. But it's also critically important to your sanity in the process. It sounds a little dramatic, but when I say kill your heroes in this, I had been going to academic conferences, and what I came to find out is that a lot of the problems and a lot of the ways that our electrodes were having difficulties, some of the top leaders in the field were having the exact same problems. They just weren't writing papers about that. So, that was a huge sanity check for me that, yes, we're actually making progress on this issue that everybody has and nobody's talking about. So, again, no one knows what they're doing. You have to get out there and you have to talk to people to be confident in where you stand in the field and where you want to go next. Next slide. And this brings us to just one of the most difficult parts to pitch of our history. Improving the electrodes was the right thing to do. It is a thoroughly unsexy bit of progress to share. For a long time, we had graphs like this that we were trying to use to get engagement, both from end users and potential investors. And my partner at the time had one of the most difficult jobs ever in terms of making people excited about graphs like this. We were creating a large volume of samples of material. We were making progress, but explaining that is difficult. That being said, this graph in particular wound up being worth about $750,000 when we were finally able to get a NSF Phase 2 SBIR, or at least it wound up being a preliminary award. Next slide. So I struggled a lot about how to present this, but given that this series is supposed to be a little bit about the personal side of these journeys, it's something that I did want to put out there. I say we got preliminarily awarded that Phase 2 SBIR because around the same time that we started generating that data and we made traction on that grant, I also found out that I was in need of some pretty major surgery. Without getting too much into it, I had a leaky heart valve. They wound up breaking most of my ribs, bunch of plates, Teflon ring around the heart, bunch of mesh. It was not exactly something light, and I wound up losing $750K about 2 weeks before I went into surgery. And again, that was after 2 years of a hard restart of making all that data essentially in a basement. So the takeaway is, Murphy is always watching. What can happen will happen, and you need to be prepared for eventualities. A big part of the reason I share this is not a story of toughness and grit, but it really is the fact that you're not obligated to do this for anyone. It's something you can choose to do, but you need to be clear to yourself about why you're in this and what your goals are. Next.
If we were live in class, I would do this. Good for you.
Oh, we haven't gotten to the good parts yet, believe it or not. So again, and you're starting to see now why I kind of belabored the structure here. So you know, you get out of that surgery and, you know, the hardest part, believe it or not, wasn't the surgery. That was always going to be a success. It was always going to suck, but it was going to be fine. But man, you know, as much as you get a clap for that, no one writes you an investment check for having endured that. You know, there is a hard stigma to shake off of being 27 and having gone in for heart surgery, especially in a town like Albany. It is very difficult to raise money at that point. So, you know, we were operating on very little budget. Things were very, very difficult. And again, you have to go back to the guideposts that you've laid out for yourself. Is it still valuable? Yes. Is it still possible? Absolutely, yes. We were on track before this sidestep. Is it possible for me? And this is where you kind of look at it and, you know, again, you can throw in the towel, but I sort of went the other direction and said, well, shit, it can't really get any harder at this point, right? Like, we've gotten this far. And again, this is where I went back to the last criteria. Is anyone else going to do this if I don't? And Kelly's heard me say it, but man, I just wish I had a competitor that would have taken me off the board at that point. Like, I would have happily moved on knowing that it was going to get done. But that wasn't the case. So you just kind of calmly move on to, you know, what you got to do. And you can be filled with piss and vinegar about it, and that'll get you through a tough week, a tough month, maybe a tough year. But if you want to make it for the long haul, you know, you have to have kind of a calm evaluation of this kind of situation. So next. But we were able to get there. Again, there are things you can do, great things you can do, even in a basement. We started building out from the samples that we had generated, we were able to make larger versions of the electrodes, and we were able to finally get back in the field. The hardware you're seeing there doesn't look like much, but the electrodes it housed were something that others had thrown $30 million at and couldn't get done. So the unit you're seeing there was deployed at Brown's Brewing up in Hoosick Falls. That was sort of our first entrance back into the field. That went very, very well. We learned a lot of different technical things that I won't get into unless someone has a specific interest, but moving right along. The following year, we got a little bit bigger yet. With that data, we were able to secure a grant through the state of Massachusetts. This is at the Pittsfield Wastewater Treatment Plant. One thing that I love about this photo is each of those tanks is about the size of the kitchen you saw earlier in the slide deck here. I always like that for scale. So next. And we were able to make what was and is the world's biggest microbial fuel cell. You know, again, most of these things in the world are about the size of a shoebox or a car battery. And those electrodes that you see there are taller than I am. So we hit a huge milestone that we now got to the point where we're not talking about shitty looking graphs anymore. We've got a honest to goodness full-size microbial fuel cell that we can point at people, and that's where they start to really get excited. Next. And this is what that implementation looks like. And again, this is where we knew that despite what all outward appearances looked like, you know, we were doing something that nobody else was going to do. Is you needed the academic knowledge and, you know, the willingness to get out. You know, we poured that concrete pad, all of that plumbing I installed myself in negative 20-degree weather in the Berkshires in February. You know, no tenured professor is going to sign up to do that. You know, one, it's not what they're best at, and, you know, two, it's not that fun. And on the flip side, normally that's where industry would pick up, but there had just been a failure to pass that baton. You know, the academic field and what traditionally would be the pipeline to get that into the field had failed to connect, and somebody had to make that union. So next slide. And, you know, that's why, you know, this past February was just one of the most exciting times in my life. In October, we had, with the data from that pilot that you just saw, we went to Aquatech in Amsterdam. You know, Amsterdam overseas, not Amsterdam 20 minutes down the highway here. And we were finally able to connect to large entities to start having those discussions about those B2B relationships that, you know, really put meat on the skeleton of the business model. And again, further driving home the point that you need to get out there and talk to people. I had been working trade shows in the US for, I'd say 6 years at that point. It took me one in the right place before I was talking to, you know, an entity that was everything that I hoped it would be and more. So that's about when I was able to give that presentation at Startup Tech Valley. You know, we were finally had all the pieces. We've got our unit in the field. You know, we've got a customer that we're in, you know, big conversations with. The data's streaming in this whole time. We've been, you know, increasing the quality of the mechanical build. All the pieces are coming together. And then, next slide. You guys kind of know the rest. That was February 2020, and Murphy is always watching. You know, certainly the progress that we have is still on the table. You know, we're still in those conversations, but, you know, risk of B2B, large things like that impact people's budgets and their strategic focus. And one more time, pivot, move on, or double down. Is it still valuable? Yes. Is it possible? Hell yes. Is it possible for me? Yes, we're doing it. Is anybody else going to do it? I don't care, because it's going to be us this time around. Those kind of guideposts are incredibly important. And, you know, wrapping all of this up, there's a reason this pitch isn't that polished. There's a reason I don't mind that a lot of these photos are blurry. There's a reason if you go on our website, you know, it's not, you know, as slick as some software pitches. And that's because, again, there is no single right way to do innovation. You know, what we found when we have had more polish on it is it helped, but only so much. And it ultimately wound up distracting from, you know, a lot of what was leading to those B2B interactions that we desperately needed. More to the point, you know, we stayed a very small company. When we lost all of our folks, we never really staffed up, because what we found is that we were able to engage contract engineering, contract manufacturing. And, you know, what I found is that I don't need a mechanical engineer 12 months out of the year. I need them intensely for different projects. And then after that, I intensely need a chemical engineer. So for us, success didn't look like having a lot of full-time employees. And I think that's important, is you can't really have a preconception about what your journey is going to look like or what it's going to take for you to get to your goal. You have to be open to that changing. And again, you know, I certainly didn't know that at the start. You know, I plan to be wrong about a lot more things. And again, no one knows what they're doing. Speaking in, again, that sees just a good life tip for y'all, but last slide, please. The only thing, if you remember one thing other than the crazy guy talking about sewage, it's that you guys can learn an awful lot from Jason and Kelly, but there is only one right way to do innovation, and that's whatever gets it done. You know, it is the one thing that you are judged solely by the success of accomplishing your mission. You know, FedEx only exists because the guy took his payroll and played blackjack with it. There are a million ways to do this story. And, you know, I hope you at least dip your toes into finding out yours. So I'd love to open it to questions, be it technical, product development, you know, just general. Any of that would be great.
All right, let's give him a hand there. Thanks, Brent.
Hey, Brent, I have a question.
Sure.
Was there a breakthrough? Were these little tiny steps of solving little issues, or was there a breakthrough that allowed you to scale up and be more efficient?
So it was kind of, in true to form, the answer is yes. It's hard without getting into the technical details, but we had spent a lot of time defining what you could do on this full-scale manufacturing platform. We had a lot of crappy electrodes for a while, but we were figuring out the limitations of the production equipment. And eventually, those limitations inform the experiments you run to build one that will work. And that allowed us to have that breakthrough moment where, you know, when we had it, we're like, oh, we got one, we can make 1 million now. So that was very helpful. And then, yeah, there were a couple other like very technical things that, one of the things I left out is that while I was recovering from surgery, most of the field moved on. You know, the grant funding for it had kind of dried up. Everybody knew it, you know, didn't work at that point, which was gravy for me because that left a wide open field. And during that time, we got 4 more patents, mostly around manufacturing, that frankly, a bunch of other people should have beaten us to. So.
Where was Murphy?
Well, anything that can happen, and that includes me.
All right.
Leah, if you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
So this is probably a little bit more on the technical side of things, but like, how big is this technology in terms of the energy consumption? Like, will it allow for wastewater treatment plants to generate electricity, or just break even?
Absolutely. So right now we focus on turning the blowers off. And the reason is because that's just such a big slug. For them, it's about 2/3 of their OPEX, or excuse me, 2/3 of their energy expenditure, about 1/3 of their OPEX. It's $1 million a year power bill. So our first goal is just turn that off, and then anything above that is gravy. But the energy is there. There's like 7 times the energy in the wastewater. The trick is really, can you pull it out at a fast enough rate? And so that's where, again, kind of going a little bit meta on the product development pathway, we said, okay, if you can make money turning the aerators off, you know, that'll get you the funds you need to really make some, you know, improvements on the electrodes. And boy, do you have a reason to. Furthermore, you know, what I really hoped and still hope is that if we start making a ton of money getting these out in the field, that we get other people who come to me and say, hey, I got a catalyst. You didn't know it, but I've been working on this. And if you put this in your electrode, it's going to go great. You know, I can't wait to the day that we've got competitors that are like, have other improvements.
I think there's a question from Anton.
Hey, Brent. So you mentioned a couple of times in your presentation of speaking in contradictions. Would you be able to give like any examples of how that worked for you and how that helped you, or like any examples of contradictions in general?
Yeah, I mean, so that's really more of it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek amount or tongue-in-cheek comment on oratorial technique. You know, when you speak with something that on the surface is apparently contradictory, you inherently force the listener to kind of stop and reconcile that fact. So I've found when you're pitching or even when you're talking that if you place that around something that you really want someone to hear, you sort of break the cycle. You know, and that's your goal a lot of times in interacting with people is to break people out of autopilot. That works also really well if you're doing market research and you're calling up somebody who, you know, says, oh, you know, this is Midas Technologies, you know, how are you doing today? And then you ask, oh, I'm doing great, how are you? And you pause and wait for the response, right? Like that normal kind of flow of information that everybody does on autopilot. If you pause and wait for that, you all of a sudden have their full attention. It's just a psychological hack. But it comes to a broader point that, you know, this presentation was meandering a little bit, but you know, I would encourage you to try your hand at any public speaking, like stand-up comedy, anything where you practice getting the content out in addition to, you know, just what you're saying.
I know that we are running up against the end time. We had a little late start, so I'm going to keep going for a few more questions. But I did want to just mention one aspect of this class. So you're meant to have at the end of this class, the full final deliverable was just a short reflection from each speaker. This is just a couple sentences that it captures to kind of signal that you've been here and have absorbed it, and also just give you a chance to incorporate something. So keep that in mind, keep that log as you go forward. And then we've got a question from Buffy.
Yeah, hi. So I just have like a question on, so that you mentioned that this technology has been available for a while in the academic world, and what do you think it's the transition between the academic world to the market still hasn't happened yet?
Well, the cheeky answer is because I'm working on it. But the more direct answer is there was all this bench scale data that was phenomenal, but making a electrode that's this big versus the ones that you saw in the pilot is night and day. Without getting too much into it, the different microstructure and everything that you wind up with as you make a larger electrode panel significantly changes the performance. So there was a lot of excellent foundational knowledge that was there, but there just wasn't the effort going through to manufacture it. And I think that was a huge gap, and we saw that as a huge opportunity.
Great. I guess we'll take one more question from Tyree, and then I have one last question that we're going to try to ask to all the speakers.
Sure.
Oh, thank you. I guess my question kind of comes from a personal standpoint. I always hear like a lot of 50% of small businesses always fail in those first 5 years. So what kind of keeps you motivated and kind of push past the frustration setbacks in those first 5 or 10 years when you're starting out?
Yeah, that again, that's sort of what I was trying to lay out with my personal sort of guidelines there is, for me personally, it was really as simple as what I laid out. It's just every time I thought about throwing it in, and in reality, that really was only 6 or 7 times. I've always had this voice in my head that was, all right, so, you didn't make it there, but you know what you're doing next. For me, it was as long as I wasn't tilting at windmills, as long as I was making progress and the goal was still worth reaching, at that point, it just comes down to how many times can you get at bat. And the answer for me has always been, well, at least one more. And, you break it down that way, you eat the elephant one bite at a time. But again, that can be costly. There's been personal relationships that I've had that have been significantly strained by this. My own mental sanity at times, if you ask Jason and Kelly, I'm sure. So, people are a lot tougher than they tend to think at the beginning, but you're not obligated to take this trip, and you're not obligated to take it all the way through to get all of the benefits. I learned an enormous amount in the first 3 years. That was just the first year, hell. At any step along the way, you're getting payout on this.
Great. So Brent, if you were here at Rensselaer during your freshman year, let's take you back in time. 2 questions. One is, what would you be working on?
Well, at that point, I would be doing protein folding research with Freddie right there. I signed up in his lab, and I learned an enormous amount. But the biggest thing I learned is that a PhD was not going to be for me. Knowing what I know now, my freshman year, I would have kept pretty similar. I needed to have that academic lab experience to know that, hey, this is really great, but it's not where I shine. And I needed to meet the Innovative guys to see them, making some of their first samples in a basement and going, holy crap, you can do this? You just kind of start doing it, and then you're doing it, and that's great. My freshman year wouldn't have been different. Following up with that, I probably would have started the business plan competitions much earlier. Get your ass kicked by those as quickly as possible.
Great. And one last question. So what do you wish you would have learned more of? What information would have been most useful as an entrepreneur had you had to take, say, an extra couple classes while you were here at Rensselaer?
For me, it was electrochemistry. That is a dark art. Even amongst chemists, that is a tricky discipline that there were a lot of smart people right there that, that just didn't really fit my BCBP curriculum. And good news is I found a lot of those folks after I graduated, and bad news is I had to pay money for their time at that point. But yeah, I do wish I would have understood the power of making a phone call more. I think I did that better than most, but if you're in an academic field, it doesn't matter what the field is. If you know somebody whose work you really like or think they're doing the right thing, you just call them up to chat. 9 times out of 10, they're going to be really stoked to, like, you know, just have a conversation with you. And especially as I was learning the field, I wish I would have done that earlier. You know, all the researchers in the field, I could pick them up and we'd be on a first name basis now, which is great. So.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Brent. Next week, we have John Haller, right?
Right.
So we've got John Haller. In addition to being one of my neighbors, he's one of the amazing serial entrepreneurs that we've had at Rensselaer. He started off right out of school as the CTO of MapInfo. Had a startup called Near Me that he spent a few years on that was based on kind of similar technologies early in the geofencing and other types of spaces where people were using computers for the first time to understand location. And then he found himself helping design an application for what I think he's going to talk about most times for next week, an application for a sports team that his wife was managing to be able to essentially help the teams to manage various sign up and other coordination processes. He turned that into a really successful business that he sold it to Sports Illustrated Time Magazine a few years ago. So he's got a great story. He's just a wonderful guy, and I'm excited to have him here next week to be our second speaker. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Brent, for kicking this off. I'd encourage you to, be involved in the different activities that Severino mentions, or that we'll mention here, and that are available to you as students. The problem competition is definitely one that is easy to do. Find a problem. Here was wastewater. This is still a problem that you could potentially get involved in solving. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for having me.